don't think I've ever experienced a feeling of meh quite as strongly as I did whilst playing Tunic. At no point over the several hours I spent exploring its world did I find myself leaning forward, utterly engrossed by what was happening, but I equally never found myself utterly disgusted with the experience, so there's that. My entire review could be the sentence, Tunic is a game that exists, and then I could knock off and find the next project to waste 2 weeks of my life with, but you know what, you took the time to be here, so here we go. Tunic is an isometric action-adventure game published by Finji and developed by someone named Andrew Schuldice. I don't know how to say your name, I'm so sorry. Someone I know nothing of. It hit the stores last year and I did intend to get to it sooner, thinking that in the days up to its release it looked kind of entertaining, but then I just sort of forgot about it. Don't take it personally, Tunic, my ADHD brain doesn't really do that whole object permanence thing, so the second I stopped looking at you, I forgot you were there. I did that with my dinner a few days ago. So what is Tunic about? Well, the game follows a green tunic wearing fox with no voice or discernible personality in their quest to move forward. If I'm being honest, the very beginning of the game gives you virtually nothing to go on. You progress through this mysterious island and find a mailbox, but when you click on it, it shows these runes that you cannot read and are not expected to. What's the point of this, you ask? Well, there doesn't appear to be much of a point outside of them being just mysterious for mysterious's own sake. Get used to this now because very few words in this game are written in English, or your main language, whatever that may be, with most being taken up by these runes for which no real translation seems possible. As you move, you quickly find your first weapon, a stick, and then you can engage in combat. For combat, you'll have the option to lock on to make the fight easier, and you can use your weapon by pressing whichever button you've assigned the weapon to. You'll notice you have a stamina bar, but it's not used for attacks, it's only used for dodging and blocking later when you get a shield. A little further in, you'll find one of these shrines, and these serve as your checkpoints. Tunic does the whole souls thing, where when you rest at a checkpoint, you recover your lost health and any of your primary healing items you may have expended, but all the enemies respawn. They also let you level up by bringing certain items to them and spending some currency to raise a single stat at a time. The items you'll need you'll find in the various chests that litter the land, cause video games, and the currency that is acquired mainly through defeating enemies, though some pots also have some, so embrace your inner Link, you fucking vandal. Combat isn't particularly advanced. If you've ever played an old school Zelda game, then it might look rather familiar. I was going to write that the whole game would look rather familiar if you've ever played an old school Zelda game, but then I thought about it and it's only really the superficial elements that can draw comparison, they said, pretending they've ever played a Zelda game before. But combat is quite basic. You mash the attack button to defeat most things. When the enemies glow pink, that means they're about to hit you, so you need to dodge or block if you have the shield by now, and the main rule is if the enemy has a big weapon, it's better to dodge than block. That is most of what you'll need to know for a decent portion of the game, but to be fair, this isn't inherently bad. Keeping the rules simple means a wider audience can engage with your game, and I am all for that, though there are some things you should consider. The feedback, for instance. A good game knows how to effectively display when you land a hit or when an opponent does so against you, and I am happy to say that Tunic does this, just not really in the right way. See, it's stupidly easy for the first hit of your combo to push enemies out of the way of the rest of your combo, and the same can happen to the enemies who are attacking you. Don't get me wrong, I am glad that it's made immediately obvious to me that I'm actually hitting my enemies. It's just done so in the most basic way, and it makes combat feel like way more of a chore when forced to engage with it repeatedly. The thing the game does even less well is the feel of combat. Let me compare this to another action-oriented title that favours third-person melee combat. Elden Ring. Haha, you thought it was going to be Dark Souls, didn't you? I mean, it pretty much is, but like not really. When your character swings a sword, thrusts a spear or fires a bow, there is a focus by the team to make sure there is a level of satisfaction that corresponds to the kind of weapon that you're using. A giant sword that for some reason weighs 50 tons should feel like you're swinging the seventh knob of God around, and everything from how your character moves their body to the specific sound effects and enemy reactions all work together to make the attack feel satisfying. It's incredibly important for games that have a focus on combat to get that feel right, and in my opinion Tunic didn't quite nail this. There was a clear attempt made, but it ultimately feels underwhelming. This could be due to the fact that whilst you start the game with a stick, you'll quickly find a sword, and this is the intended melee weapon for the rest of the game. All other forms of attack are either bombs that you throw or magic spells that you cast with items, so melee variety is virtually non-existent and it quickly becomes stagnant. Neither spells or bombs feel like they have much impact as a rule. The only things that really feel weighty are the ice bombs because of the huge crystals they produce in their blast, but otherwise these things feel relatively light and unimpactful. Luckily, combat isn't the only thing that Tunic does, it also provides the player a big world to explore. It's just a shame it forgot to put anything worth finding. Sorry, that was a bit snarky. The game isn't exactly an open world, it's more of the linear open-ended style, and to offer credit where it's due, for the most part, the wandering around and discovering treasure chests, shortcuts and bosses is fine. I'm the kind of person who just loves exploring virtual worlds to see what neat details I find and what cool treasure I can get my hands on. Tunic is alright when it comes to little details that serve to build the world. We get the sense that a civilization used to flourish here and that some calamity occurred that led everything to winding up in a state of ruin, though I think they could have done a bit more to decorate because a fair amount of the time we're just in a big open space that has slightly different wallpaper, but mostly it's well done in this regard. I am less thrilled about the treasure, however. As I said before, the sword really is your only viable option for melee, with the other tools you find being magic items that can vary from game-changingly useful to complete wastes of space. The magic wand is really effective for picking off the few flying and ranged enemies you'll encounter and for triggering explosives, but it deals so little damage to everything else that it mostly sat in my equipment because I didn't have any decent alternatives. The ice dagger freezes enemies in place, and if you're lucky you can get maybe 3 hits on them before they break free. The ice doesn't make them any weaker to your attacks or anything, it literally just holds them down for a couple of free hits, and given how much mana it costs to cast one of these, it's really not worth it. You know, you might as well just use it in the first area you find it in to beat the boss, and then never again. This orb is really useful, but more for its utility because you can use it to get around by hooking onto certain objects, but in combat it's not really worth using because all it does is pull enemies closer. Ranged enemies are notoriously weak, so the piss weak wand works fine enough to dispatch them, and all the other enemies will always run at you anyway because they're also melee focused, and the difference between traversal and battle is that the wand doesn't use mana for traversal, it does for battle. This is a good time to mention that I really appreciate the game telling me how many uses each magic thing has with my current mana pool, but all magic draws from said pool, so it's best not to use the orb in combat because you might need the wand to snipe or blow something up. I can also respect the game wanting to have a more old school combat system where certain tools are more situational than others. I just don't think that it was pulled off as well as it could have been, and it meant that whenever I found a new treasure I was more like, huh, okay, more than like, oh fuck yes. I think the fact that the sword is so straightforward in a do you want to hit once, twice or thrice sort of way doesn't help either. I'm not saying that the combat is bad at all, it works, and I do personally like some of the mechanics, like how some enemies drop stuff to recharge your mana when they die, and how if you defeat an enemy at range, the currency they will drop will not come right to you like it will if you kill them with a melee attack, as even if you walk away after doing the melee kill, the currency will always rush over to you. This is a perfectly serviceable way of making a risk versus reward system. It's riskier to melee most enemies, but in doing so you'll be guaranteed to get all of the currency they drop, whereas keeping your distance and sniping might mean you're safer, but it will cause the little cubes of money whatever to drop and sometimes fall into places where you cannot reach them. Ultimately though, I just don't think this combat is as well designed as it could be. I wouldn't dwell if the combat wasn't such a big part of the game, but the game is very focused on the battles, with areas swarming with enemies and big powerful bosses awaiting you at the end of levels. The bosses themselves are interesting enough, and I really don't have anything to complain about here. In fact, I quite like the fight with this big giant siege robot spider thingy. It has 2 weak points to exploit, one on the head and one on the butt. The one on the butt is harder to reach, but it's safer to go after, whereas the one on the head will have you needing to risk taking hits from some of the more dangerous attacks. Again, a perfectly good risk-reward system. It'd be cooler if the weak points weren't the only places you could damage the thing at all. I always think that's a bit lazy, but for the most part the bosses are engaging enough to fight and we're all distinct from one another, which I always appreciate. The first boss fight is just a tougher enemy that you'll see loads of later on, but as it serves as more of an introduction to the bosses themselves, I won't be too harsh. As you progress, you'll need to find these 3 keys. See, there is this entity sealed away in the Shadow Realm, or whatever the hell this place is, who seems to need our help, and there are these statues of the thing everywhere. So logically, when we see the thing that needs the blue, green and red keys that look similar to the cell the thing is trapped in, we know what to do. The manual will roughly guide you to where the keys are, though I did have a hard time finding the green one because the way to reach it was locked behind a door, which had a key very close by. The only issue was it was on a ledge around a corner that the fixed camera couldn't show me, and there's just as much chance that area would have been empty space, so it makes sense as to why I didn't search it sooner. I don't mind the game's fixed camera on its own. I am however less fond of how a lot of the hidden routes and items are just hidden by virtue of them being somewhere where you can't see because of the constant perspective. It's not bad design, it's just not very inspired. To find a lot of these I had to dedicate a fair amount of my time to just hugging the walls as I explored and hoping they led somewhere, and if you are moving there is a high chance that the interaction prompt just won't happen, so chances are good there is more hidden treasure around corners that I can't see, because for a lot of things you have to be completely stationary before any prompt will even happen. Again, it isn't a bad way to do hidden stuff, it's just not a particularly creative means of doing so. It's a very basic way for the game to hide vital tools from the player. Come to think of it, I didn't really talk about the manual at all, did I? Well, you see, you'll be gathering these pages as you go throughout the game, and they'll be pasted together to create the game's manual. Inside you'll find tips and maps and such to make the game easier. I'm neither for nor against this method of presenting the user manual. It is kind of odd that one of the main collectibles in the game is the booklet that tells you how to play the fucking thing, and I don't blame anyone who just wants to Google this shit, but it is different I suppose, and I do like building towards something tangible. Again though, it is definitely strange that we spend most of the game looking for the pages to make this little book, and the fact that the book is written mostly in the runes that you can't translate is a kind of what the fuck situation, but as I say, I don't feel strongly one way or the other about it. So the gameplay as a whole is functional, but lacking in any real meat. The combat encounters could be challenging at least, so there is that, and I do appreciate it. I just think that the game itself feels more like a foundation, mechanically speaking, than a fully fleshed out product. A good foundation, and one that you could do a lot with, we just need the stuff to be done with it. But how does the story fare in all this? You discover on an unnamed island the trapped soul of a legendary figure who once opened a tomb and discovered some bad things that led to their soul becoming trapped, and now we seem to be caught up in a weird cycle, but that's all I have for you. And again, this is not something that, on its own, is a bad thing. Let's look at Dark Souls as an example here, because I regret not using it as my example earlier. Dark Souls also shrouds its narrative in mystery and doesn't really go out of its way to make sure the player knows exactly what's happening, as this sense of confusion is rather important to its proceedings. The player is meant to feel lost at first, but the game doesn't just avoid telling you shit. You're given up front a creation myth and you meet a couple of characters who vaguely guide you to the right way to go, place B, fuck it, that's staying in, and inform you of some vital information, but anything else you want you have to figure out yourself. Tunic is definitely aiming for the whole vagueness and confusion thing. I just didn't personally engage with how Tunic went about it. I won't state that Tunic is absolutely bad and wrong for the way in which it does things, because I don't believe that it is, not for a second. I'm just arriving at the conclusion that Tunic really isn't a game for me. Later on, after you engage with the freed hero soul thing in battle and it kills you, you wake up back on the beach that you started the game on, only this time you're in a dark version of your world with all your stats reset to their defaults. The only way to change this back is to travel around the map and find the hero graves that let you teleport to the not-so Shadow Realm place thing, and you claim the item that you use to level up that stat in order to restore it. I think this is why we need those items for stat boosts as well as the dosh, even if I do still kind of think it's unnecessary and ultimately a little too restrictive, because there will only be a certain number of each of these items out in the game and this limits your potential power. I don't know, I guess I'm just still not keen on the extra tools we need, because it feels more like an arbitrary barrier and like the items only exist for this later bit so you know what each of them does when you go to reclaim it. Of course, clever visual design could also hint at what each does, like the fang being tied to damage makes sense, but the little fox head being tied to defense is a bit strange. To be 100% honest with you, viewer, I just don't really have much to say about Tunic, and everything I'm about to say in summary of the game are things you've heard me say about okay games before. Tunic is alright. It is competent and functional. I didn't have any crashes or glitches or other errors whilst playing, which is a good thing. The game has a solid art style and it makes a good use of bold colours with a pleasant enough soundtrack. There are little details in the design that I enjoy, like how you need the sword to access new areas simply because the sword can chop down bushes whereas the stick can't, and it makes sense. I also like how if you time a block just right when dealing with these little fairy motherfuckers, you can deflect their projectiles right back at them. Whilst the bombs might not feel particularly impactful, I cannot deny that they are physically quite effective for the groups. The firebomb especially, for how it continuously damages some enemies and how the fire spreads between those who are too close to one another. Of course that can backfire on the player, so again it's risk-reward, isn't it? Also, in a weird way, I kind of appreciate the way the game only lets you have 3 pieces of usable equipment on you at any time. I played on the Xbox and I have the X, Y and B buttons to use my equipment, such as my sword or my wand or any other consumables I want to use. It'll mean you need to plan ahead, learning the environments and the enemy placements so you can know when it'll be safe to rearrange your setup and what you're going to need going forward. The game has some nice accessibility options as well. Such things are always welcome. You can reduce the stamina penalties or difficulty, or hell, just enter a no-fail mode if you so wish. I personally wouldn't, that's just not how I like to play games, but I don't have an issue with it being there. Just don't tell the hardcore crowd, okay? Because the existence of anything aside from an ultra-hard mode that literally sets fire to your genitals when you fail even slightly seems to offend them, like, genuinely. It's fucking bizarre. Tunic is a perfectly playable video game, and one that I do quite respect. Nothing about this game is bad. It has some nice intrigue, it presents itself rather well, and it does all the things that it wants to do in the way it wants to do them. I fully accept that Tunic just feels like a game that isn't right for me. I didn't put it down because I was bored out of my skull, or because it was frustrating me in all the worst ways, or because it was genuinely offensive, because none of that is true, none of that happened. I just found that I personally didn't engage with it. I'm quite happy to say that I think it's a good quality video game with only a couple of genuine shortcomings which kind of impact the experience, but otherwise Tunic is fine. I respect it, I just don't fancy playing it anymore now. I spent my whole time in a near constant state of mess simply because the game wasn't clicking for me, that's all. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's video. If you played Tunic, tell me what you thought in the comments. I like reading comments, you know this. Also, let me know you got to this point. Tell me what random object I just flashed on the screen for you. Just tell me what that was in the comments if you got to this point. So anyway, take care of yourselves, my lovelies. It's always wonderful to have you here, and I will see you next time. Ta-ta.